Thanks for the opportunity. It's been great talk by Ash, and we're going to go in line with the design principles of COCLI. It's been a great opportunity for me to talk in functional Scala, and really enjoying all the talks. Thanks, Sandra, and all the organizers. Okay, let's get into this quickly. Make your config easy. Just slight introduction. Me, myself, Afsal, Sydney, working at Simple Machines. Talk to me anytime. I'm available in Discord. All right. When you say make your config easy, is it actually difficult? That's the first question that comes to our mind. Well, it depends, right? If you're talking about retrieving a set of key value pairs as strings from some data source, probably your config management is easy. But then, as I said, it depends. If you're building a config-driven application where you're exposing this data source to external users or end users, or even DevOps team, or some ops team, things get a little bit hairy. And here goes a few questions. First question is, and in fact, the most important question is your config actually type safe? And that goes back to this question of, is your application actually statically proven? Is it logically consistent? And for that, you need a type safe representation of your config. And if you're having a type safe representation of your config, how do you load this config from an external source? And what happens if there is a set of errors that is coming in? Do you fail fast, or do you accumulate all of those errors? And if you're accumulating all of those errors, how are you reporting this back to the user? And if all of this is good, how do you document your config? Is that automatically documented, or is it manually documented that quickly becomes old and invalid, and that becomes a lie? And in fact, it gives terrible user experience of your application. And do you expect the users of your config basically refer to the paragraph of documents to actually write a config? Probably that's not a good idea. You have to set an example for them so that they can start editing their config. The format should be correct. It should be auto-derived. It shouldn't be a lie. It shouldn't be an outdated one. And things like, how do you manage multiple sources in your config? And there are so many other complexities that is coming in. We will discuss all of that and even a lot more. Straight into ZIO Config. Now, this talk is going to be not just useful for the new users of ZIO Config. It can be useful for existing users as well. Like, you might realize that, oh, this is another way of interacting with ZIO Config. To begin with, we have a simple representation of your toy example, my config, that has a host and port. And you would guess that you're looking for a host which is of the type string, and a port which is of the type int in some data source. And the first step with ZIO Config is to define, this is actually one of the patterns that you can follow to interact with ZIO Config. Okay, so the first step can be defining a config source, and you can retrieve a config source from a simple Scala map. Give a key value pair. Here we have given host and port. So this is like a valid source. And the next step is to derive a program automatically or manually. We are going to go with automatic because we are lazy people. We try and derive a program. So what exactly is a program with respect to config? It's a program that says, hey, I have a host, which is of the type string. I have a key called port, which is of the type int. And if both of them are available, form this case class, which we have seen before, which is my config. And that is the program. And we are going to call that program config descriptor. Okay, for the rest of the talk, I'll be referring to config descriptor and program. They all are the same, right? It's just program. And the fun thing here is it's not doing anything. It's just a description. And then you pass this description to an action called read. So the reason for why I wanted to talk about this pattern when you interact with ZIO Config is that program is completely independent of actions. And in fact, you can see program is independent of even source. You're attaching a source to an existing program. Your descriptor of my config is deriving the program, and you're attaching the source, and that still remains a program, which is config descriptor, and you pass that to the action called read, and you get the result. Obviously, you will get a right of my config because there can be a left of errors. And not only automatic is supported, in fact, the most supported way of defining config is the manual description. And I personally love writing manual descriptions, especially when our config is not too big. It is more easy, more maintainable, and less compile time. Again, you can imagine what this is doing. String of host means there is a host, there is a key called host, and the values of the type string combined with, for many of you who are the users of Scala Z, you know that's like an applicative operator. But here you don't have any type class constraints. It's just simple functions. This is a config descriptor. This is just a function that is available in config descriptor, just a combinator. And then you combine that with the next config descriptor, which is an int of port saying there is a port key of the value and the type of the value is int. And if both of them are available, apply to the my config. You can see also an unapply. That means it also knows how to write these config back. Anyway, we'll come back to write the config back at a later point. The rest of this example is same. You pass this program to read. Obviously, in the first manual description, you're not talking anything about source. You're attaching the source at a later point, still a program, and then when you pass that to read, you'll get a write of your my config. All right, that was a simple example. And where exactly is the type safety? And I don't have time to explain why type safety, but as functional programmers, we all know the importance of type safety and the amount of logical consistency that it can bring to your application. And config retrieval is the first step. Most of the times it is the first step in your application, and it's important that we get into the type safe world as early as possible. Now, some of the behaviors of your application, if you push that to data types, strong data types, using products and co-products. When I say co-product, this is an ADT. This is a co-product that says there is a credentials provider. This is just an example. This is nothing related to any AWS SDK, but it's your own data type. There is a credentials provider, and that credentials provider can be a default provider, or it can be a set of token and secret. And this is the way you say authenticate with AWS. And the user configure either default or credentials depending on where your application is running. Doesn't matter. This is part of your config. So my config consists of credentials provider, which is a seal trait, which is a co-product. I'm again using auto derivation. I'm calling descriptor of my config. I got the program. I'm defining a source. You can see I am defining a flattened map source, and I'm making it nested with respect to the delimiter that you have passed. Simply shows the fact that it doesn't matter what the source is. It doesn't matter the format of the source is. ZIO Config allows to retrieve nested or flattened source depending on your application and the way you configure things. And you're trying to read that config from that source. As you can imagine, this is going to give you errors. And that goes back to accumulation of errors. And this error is like a tree-like structure, right? It keeps the structure of your config as it is. So the way you need to interpret this is, in every branch, you'll have multiple errors. In the first branch, you have a format error, and then you have another error, which can be 2 missing values. So you have to fix at least 1 error in each branch. So if I am fixing errors in the first branch, I either need to fix this format error, which says, hey, your provider is just as simple as a constant default. Or I need to fix these 2 missing values, where if you're passing a credentials, well, you better off pass secret and token. Okay, that said, the next important and most useful feature when I used ZIO Config in production was multiple sources. I always felt that why would I ever need multiple sources, but it always came up. So these are the set of config that user can pass as an external file. And this config can only be through a command line. And this config can only be through a system environment because you are running in a containerized environment. Who knows? We have multiple source supports for ZIO Config. And in this example, I'm giving, you can retrieve from command line arguments, or you can retrieve from system environment, and you can merge them together using orals combinator. And when you pass this program by attaching this source, you get some result where it first tries to retrieve these config from system environment. If that is absent, it goes back to trying whether they are available in command line. You can also attach sources per field. So everything is a program, right? String of username is a program that describes I need a username, which is of the type string, and I need to get that from system environment. A string of password can be retrieved from credential source. Credential source is nothing, is not a part of ZIO Config, but that shows that you can actually create custom config source fairly easily. As far as your source is able to give you a value for a key, you can quickly form a config source, and then you can have a custom one, such as credential source, and attach all the passwords to it. And I'm using manual derivation in this case. You can also use all of this in automatic world too. And I'm also using a test source. Because I'm writing test, I can't go ahead and create mock services for each and everything. So most of the times you can see functional programmers talking about, hey, it's just a matter of passing functions. Why would I want to have a mock? And things like that. It's important to have mock services, but not always. So in this case, I can update the entire sources in your description with a test source. So in here, I'm overriding all of the sources that is in the config descriptor with a test source, and it's going to work because its username and password is already passed into the test source. So in your test, it never goes and try to read things from system environment or credential source. The next important feature was rich documentation. And I would like to say that when we started with ZIO Config, building ZIO Config, this feature was in our mind. It's designed in a way that this should be supported. It's not any later addition. So it gels well with the way ZIO Config is designed. And you can have a lot of flexibility in how you create documentation. We'll see how. Now, until now, we passed our program or config descriptor to an action called read. But you can also pass the same program to a generate docs action, which is another action, from where you can actually retrieve a markdown file. And that markdown file can be a GitHub flavored one or a Confluent flavored one. It depends on, most of the times you might need a Confluent flavored one. I've never worked in a company where they don't use Confluent. So it was important that that feature should be there in ZIO Config. So this is all there in ZIO Config. And that's going to look like that. And this implies I have a field called provider, and provider can be any one of credentials or a primitive, which is a default. If it is credentials, it should be satisfied with all of the fields in credentials, and hence the format all of. Well, then the next question that we might face is, should user go into this markdown file, read all of the bits, and then start writing a config? I don't think that's fair enough. Instead, we should set an example for them, and they can still use this documentation for reference when they try and fill the values. All right, so we're now going to generate a config for the user. This is another example where I said a config can be a seal trait. In this case, I'm defining AWS region. My seal trait in this case has got a custom name. You can use name annotation. You can also have all of these features in manual derivations as well, by the way. Name is part of the automatic world. And then this AWS region, which can either be US East or AP Southeast Australia, it can be part of a bigger config called my config. And just for adding some complexity, I've added another case class called endpoint, right? And even the developer doesn't know how this is going to look like in the actual data source. So the first thing that you could do, the way you can communicate back to the user, hey, this is a way you have to write your config. You pass the same program to a different action. Instead of generate docs or read action, you pass generate config JSON, and there is generate config map, and there is generate config HOCON. You pass that program and you just specify how many config that I need, because your config can take any shape, because your config is type safe. It is trying to address core products and products. So it can take any shape. In this case, the first shape has region. It can take any shape and any value, right? Region can be having a value AP Southeast. A region can be having a value US East. And it is looking at your custom names, and it produces exactly the same value. Now you pass this to the user and ask them to start editing things. Now, all of these features are available because ZIO Config can write things back into the source. So what that means is, if you have already got a my config value with you, and you have got a program that describes your config, you pass that to a write action. Instead of a generate config JSON or a generate docs or a read action, you pass this to write action, and you get a property tree, and that tree can be converted to any structure. So this means you can write this back to any formats. It is independent of the source as well. It's not just writing things to HOCON, for instance. All right. And you can also think about this functionality that makes ZIO Config be part of any part of your application. Recently, I've been using ZIO Config for state management, where I represent the state of the application as simple product and co-product. I write this back. This state can be, hey, the job is running, or the job has failed, or the job has started, whatever state that is. I'm writing this to a source using a descriptor, using a program. And when the application spins up, it reads that state again using the same descriptor, and it is guaranteed to work because you use the same descriptor to read. You use the same descriptor that you write to read, and it's gonna work. That round trip is always going to work. And this is another example where I can write this back to HOCON. It's like a superset of JSON. Now, work with refined types. Refined has been a great library. I always use that. It is representing your validations in types, and your application quickly becomes so robust and reliable. Even before ZIO Config, I used to use refined types. So it was important that this functionality should be supported by ZIO Config using a module called ZIO Config Refined. Here I have a non-empty string. So your host or your username cannot be empty. And you have an ID that cannot be less than 1024. And you're using that as part of your case class. And I have an invalid source where ID is 10, which is less than 1024, and username, which is empty. And you pass the program to the read action, and you get this wonderful accumulation of errors. You have already seen this. You have to fix at least one error in each branch, meaning I have two branches. I have one error in each of these branches. So I have to fix both these conversion errors. One is username can't be empty, and an ID cannot be less than 1024, and you get that for free. It was a quick glimpse of all the features that ZIO Config can provide right now. But let's dive into a bit more. A few questions, such as what are the sources that ZIO Config supports? Supports property source, map, command line, system environment, HOCON, YAML, and each of these has got different strategies to retrieve. Sometimes it can be a file, sometimes it can be a string. And obviously this, I have intentionally got rid of the return types. The return types are either for most of them, because you can pass a invalid string into your HOCON, and there is no point passing a program to an invalid source at that point. So if your source itself is invalid, here goes the error. And if you can define a source, you can attach that source to a program. We have seen this. We have seen examples for this. Here we are attaching a HOCON file. If you can attach a source to a program, you can obviously update the sources in a program. We have also seen this, which is data source overriding. Here I'm giving a constant source. If nothing works, take it from my constant source. It's not really overriding. It's like a fallback. And then if you can update, you can also strip off the config sources. I love that functionality. You can strip off all the source information from your entire program by calling just unsourced, and then you can pass a constant source. So you just got confused about all the credential source and system environment. You don't want to know about updating the source. You just peel off all the config sources from your program and pass a constant source. And that will always work because your constant source is given the proper values in your tests. Or it can be even used in your application. Your constant source can be a default source. A little bit more about manual descriptor. We said you can manually describe config using programs exposed through a config descriptor module in ZIO Config. This is int of port, meaning you're trying to retrieve an integer. But then you can call a function called transform or fail that takes two functions as arguments. One is given an integer how to form this port. It's like a new type. It's like a smart constructor. And if it is less than 1000, fail it. Otherwise, I'm giving a proper port. And you also need to do, given a port, how can I retrieve the value integer? And that's quite straightforward, port.n. You also have transform or fail left and transform or fail right. So either of them can fail. Another example is how do you describe a list? That's also simple. If you understand what a string of username, that means there exists a key called username and the values of the type string. If you think along the same lines, there exists a key called ports and the values of the type list, but list is not really a type, it is a type constructor. You have to say what type of list. So you say list of integer. And this int that I'm showing here is a config descriptor. Right? So you can pass a config descriptor of a case class, and quickly this becomes a list of records under the key ports. We also seen some magical implementation of refined types using auto derivation. So I have seen a lot of users looking at manual description, which I feel really happy about that. So how can they use refined types with their manual descriptions? In this case, refine string non-empty can be, you can pass a key to refine type, right? And you say, this is my refine type, this is my constraint. So it can actually take a key, actual string, or it can actually take a config descriptor itself, which is a very recent addition. Most of these features came in the last few months, or I would say last few weeks. So this was not ergonomic before. Now we have refined. So here I already form a config descriptor, and then I am giving this to a refine function, which will refine your config descriptor entirely. So your list cannot be less than 2 quickly. And interestingly, a config descriptor may not need to know the keys. You can actually skip the keys and it is still a config descriptor. And that shows a bit of composability thing in the entire design of ZIO Config. And where do we use this? So for example, you try and retrieve an either. So a double is a config descriptor, string is a config descriptor, or else either is a combinator, and that shows take a value of double. If that fails, and the only reason to fail is it's not a double. Otherwise, you try and fetch that as a string, but then you haven't provided any keys for that. You can provide the keys at a later stage, which is nested version. So nested is a function that takes a key and a config descriptor. This is exactly the same as double of version, or else say the string of version. But you're repeating the keys. And if you're giving a source such as HOCON, a version 1.1 means you're taking a left of 1.1. It gives you a left of 1.1. Otherwise, it will give you a right of latest. Then comes this problem, like all of us are so adamant about type safety. How about not leaking that information into the config source? So when you define core products, it quickly becomes difficult for the users to satisfy your core product. For example, here is a version strategy. We are trying to fetch a version information from the user. So assuming that you are building an ETL application or a data processing application, and you need to know the version of the data that you're going to process, and you're asking it from the user. And the user is saying, hey, my version is latest, or my version is a particular number, a constant number. And you also don't know what's the name of the version. They can say minor version is equal to something, or major version is equal to something. So you don't know the name of the version either. So you're trying to retrieve it as a product, which is version info. And this whole thing is a part of a bigger config. Okay, this is just for example. This is one of the fields in your big configuration, because you're building an ETL application. It's just not going to be version. It's going to be which downstream system, and then downstream system can itself be another seal trait. So it can quickly get complicated, right? And if I'm exposing that seal trait as it is using some auto derivation back to the user to fetch version information, what that means is you have to ask them to pass a version info, give the name of the version, give the strategy. If it is a number, give the number n. Otherwise, you give a latest. Still, it's verbose enough. While it could be as easy as pass a version 1 or pass a version latest in a key called version info. So how can that be possible? Now you're going to see a mouthful of code quickly, but it's a type-driven, simple logic. So in order for us to be able to expose only this type of a config to the user, you can define a config descriptor just for version info. We're using a map function, and then we pass a config descriptor. We have already seen a version of this, int or else either string. This is going to give you a map whose value can be either integer or string. Int represents your constant version number, or string represent the latest version. And then you transform or fail. So given a map, form this config descriptor, form this seal trait. So if the value type is string, that means the version strategy is latest. If the value type is int, the version strategy is constant number. And you also need to check whether the value is actually string latest or not. Otherwise, you pass a left. So you are actually encoding errors as part of your descriptor. And to write that back, that's going to be really straightforward. Exactly this many lines of code. Meaning if you have a version info, you already know the strategy. If the strategy is latest, that is string latest. Otherwise, a left of into the map. Okay, you have written so much of code. Now, how do you communicate this back to the user or even to yourself? How is this all going to look like in my config? Obviously, we are lazy, so we are defining a descriptor instance. So if you read the documentation of ZIO Config, it clearly tells you that every field in your case class need to have an instance of descriptor for the automatic derivation to work. Now, this implies if you're not familiar with these type classes and auto derivations, you can obviously fall back to manual derivations all the way. But since we are lazy here, we are wrapping our manual config into this descriptor. Suddenly you get a descriptor type class instance, and then get the program of the entire my config. And I'm also saying, I don't want the keys to be the same name as that of the seal trait, because it can be annoying to see case classes names as it is camel case, just for aesthetic purpose. ZIO Config doesn't assume anything about keys. It's going to be exactly the same name as that of the classes and field names when it comes to auto derivation. If you want to change, you can manually change it by just manipulating your program, right? And then in order to communicate this back to the user, we have already seen this, pass this program, the entire program, to generate config JSON and see for yourself. Yes, this is something that can be useful. This is what user need to do. They need to change these values. And that's it. There was a lot of code, I know, and there is a lot more to discuss. And it has been a great project to work with. Thanks to John for all the wonderful advices on this project. There are 11 modules now, and we need more contributors, active contributors. And it covers a lot of surface area. On one side of the fence, you have GADTs and program introspection and write back functionality, which can be a little bit mind-bending. And on the other side of the fence, you have this type class and type class derivation using Magnolia and Shapeless. And then you have this refined module. And then recently we have this gen module. So there is a lot of surface area to cover. And on top of this, you have to keep updating the website and documentations. There are thousands of API docs released just today. And I hope this will get as user-friendly as possible by the time it hits a 1.0 release. Thanks to all the contributors, by the way. There are 38 contributors coming in and refining things and fixing things. And obviously, we need more active contributors. We need to increase that number. And I'm really looking forward. There are more issues there, good first issues. But as of now, it's nearing 1.0 and it's almost there. And I hope the talk was useful for both new users and existing users of ZIO Config.